The prairie was a living thing, breathing dust and whispers across the horizon, the sun hanging low like a dying ember. Nobody in Black Hollow expected trouble that evening, at least not the kind that would crawl into your heart before it ever touched your body. Thomas Greaves had been tending the northern fence line, leather gloves stiff, eyes scanning the horizon for coyotes or rustlers. But what he heard wasn't a coyote. It was a gasp, a ragged human sound, so faint it could have been swallowed by the wind. He froze mid-step, the rasping breath pulling at him like a hook. His horse snorted nervously, shifting in the shadow of the encroaching dusk. Thomas hadn't seen another soul in weeks, and yet, here it was, a cry that spoke of fear, hunger, and desperate hope. He scanned the dry grass, the ochre dust curling like smoke in the dying light, until he saw her. She was a girl, or maybe barely a woman, lying on the ground, half hidden beneath the brittle prairie grass. Her dress was torn, skin streaked with dirt, and her hands trembling as if the very air were a threat. Her eyes, wide and desperate, met his. "Please, not here," she whispered, voice brittle like broken glass. Thomas felt something catch in his chest, a sudden, strange tenderness mingled with caution. He should have ridden past. Nobody stayed alive long out here if you offered kindness to strangers. And yet, he couldn't. He knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible, wary of sudden movement. The girl flinched, every muscle tight, her breathing shallow. There was a mark across her wrist, faint but unmistakable, a brand. Maybe a warning or a memory she wanted no one to see. Thomas's stomach tightened. He knew the signs. Danger didn't announce itself politely in the west. Behind him, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a distant fire. Something primal whispered that this moment was no excited, and that whatever brought her here was far from finished. Thomas's hand hovered over hers, torn between the caution that had kept him alive and the impulse that now clawed at his conscience. He could leave. He could ride away into the fading sunset, pretend he never saw her. But the sound of her breathing, fragile and terrified, rooted him to the ground, and as he finally reached out, the prairie seemed to hold its breath with him. Somewhere beyond the hills, he knew someone was watching, and they would not be forgiving. Thomas hesitated, his fingers brushing hers, feeling the tiny tremor of fear that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. She flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. The brand on her wrist burned against his memory, a warning that helping her could mean ruin, or worse. Yet the quiet desperation in her eyes stirred something deeper than caution, a sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with human decency. "Why? Why are you here?" he asked, voice low, careful. The words seemed almost too loud in the still prairie. She swallowed, lips cracking, shaking her head. There was no answer, only the subtle pull of hopelessness. Thomas felt it in the tightness of his chest, the moral weight of a choice he hadn't expected to make. Leaving her meant survival, staying meant danger, possibly death. Lolled against his shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed, but the tremor never left her body. Each step toward the cabin was a question he didn't have the courage to answer. Would he be saving a life, or inviting ruin? The wind carried distant echoes, faint yet deliberate, like the warning of some unseen force. But Thomas ignored them. Compassion, he realized, had its own kind of courage. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fully claimed the prairie. The fire he lit was small, deliberate, casting trembling shadows against the log walls. She sat hunched, knees drawn to her chest, staring into the flames like they might offer answers that reality could not. Thomas studied her, noting the bruises along her arms, the hollow cheeks, the fear that didn't belong to this place but had been dragged here nonetheless. Outside, the world was vast, unforgiving, and silent. Inside, morality had taken root like a stubborn weed in parched soil. He couldn't ignore it. He wouldn't. There was a line out there somewhere, drawn by lawmen, neighbors, the unspoken rules of survival. Crossing it might mean everything, and yet he felt no hesitation. This was a moment that demanded action, not calculation. As he prepared a small bowl of stew, she whispered, barely audible, "I shouldn't be here. They'll—" Her voice broke. Thomas's hand hovered over hers again, instinctively offering reassurance, even as his mind raced with the consequences. Someone would come looking. Someone would demand justice, revenge, or blood. He had made the decision, though. The moral weight pressed on him, heavy as the night outside. Yet he felt strangely light, because sometimes doing right was the most dangerous thing a man could do, and the only thing that mattered. A rustle at the window made both of them freeze. The rustle at the window wasn't wind. Thomas's pulse jumped. His hand moved slowly to the rifle resting against the wall, careful not to startle her. Outside, shadows shifted, stretching long and deliberate across the frost-hardened grass. The moon, pale and unforgiving, revealed silhouettes moving with purpose, figures he didn't recognize, yet instinct told him they meant trouble. "They're coming," the girl whispered, voice trembling. She pressed herself against the corner of the cabin, knees drawn, fingers digging into the rough floorboards. Thomas nodded, though he knew words would do little to steady either of them. The prairie had ears tonight, and the silence between the footfalls felt like it could swallow them whole. Through the thin glass he saw faces obscured by scarves and hats, eyes glinting in the moonlight. He counted at least 4. Lawmen, outlaws, or something worse. A mob driven by fear, vengeance, or mistaken justice. Every instinct screamed to grab her and flee, but the path outside promised only open prairie and the inevitability of bullets or capture. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He whispered instructions, his voice low, deliberate. "Stay down. Don't make a sound. Whatever happens, keep your eyes on me." She nodded, trembling as he moved to the door, careful, rifle raised. The first knock came, sharp, deliberate, an unspoken demand. Then another. They weren't asking for entry, they were warning it would be forced. Thomas felt the moral weight of his choice tighten around him like a noose. If he opened the door, he could face certain violence. If he stayed silent, they might break in, and the girl could be taken, hurt, or worse. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat an echo of the countless choices he had made to survive the West. None had carried stakes like this. A whisper came from the shadows. "We know she's in there. Hand her over, and no one gets hurt." The words were calm, almost casual, but in them was the inevitability of death or disgrace. Thomas swallowed, glancing back at the girl. Her eyes were wide, trusting, frightened, and utterly human. He had no allies, no reinforcements, just the cabin walls, the rifle in his hands, and the choice he had made. A quiet standoff settled, broken only by the wind snaking through the cracks in the logs, carrying the tension like smoke. One wrong move could agree. Night violence that would stain the prairie forever. Thomas knew this. Sometimes the hardest battles were fought without firing a single shot, and tonight he would face that truth. The tension lingered like a thick fog outside the cabin, but inside, Thomas felt something shift, a quiet, fragile bond forming in the space between fear and trust. He lowered the rifle just slightly, careful, feeling the girl's gaze latch onto his hands as if searching for signs of betrayal. She didn't speak, yet her eyes said everything. Relief, hesitation, disbelief that someone might protect her rather than exploit her fear. He knelt beside her, voice low, deliberate. "You're safe, for now," he said. Though he knew it was temporary, the word safe felt fragile here, almost dishonest. Yet it was all he could offer. She exhaled, a shaky sigh, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her fingers brushed against his forearm, tentative, almost apologetic, as if even the touch of kindness demanded caution. In that gesture, Thomas saw something more than fear, a spark of humanity that had survived brutality, neglect, and terror. She wasn't just a stranger. She was a person who had endured a storm no one should bear alone. And for the first time in days, Thomas felt the weight of loneliness and loss he had carried for years lighten, if only slightly, in the presence of another human being who needed him as much as he needed purpose. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin walls, but inside, the world slowed. Every flicker of the fire painted her face in shades of amber and shadow, revealing subtle details, the line of dirt along her cheek, the hollow of exhaustion in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders that suggested she'd never been able to trust anyone. Thomas understood then that protection was more than shielding her from danger. It was showing patience, presence, and acknowledgement of her survival. They spoke little because words would dilute the moment. A nod here, a slight smile there, a brush of the hand. Each movement conveyed volumes of unspoken understanding. Trust, Thomas realized, wasn't demanded. It was built in the silence between action and intention. And then she whispered, softer than the wind, "Why? Why help me?" His answer was simple, honest, and unembellished. Because someone had to. The girl's lips quivered, and for a moment, she let herself believe it. Outside, the shadows lingered, waiting. Inside, A fragile human connection had taken root, a tether of empathy, courage, and quiet redemption that would be tested by the storm looming beyond the cabin walls. In the silence that followed, both of them knew one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The first light of dawn crept across the prairie, brushing the cabin in pale gold. Outside, the world waited, vast and indifferent. Yet inside, Thomas and the girl had carved a small sanctuary from fear. The night's tension had not disappeared. It lingered like smoke in the corners, but the immediate threat had passed, leaving in its wake something harder, deeper, understanding. Thomas watched her stir, her movements slow, cautious, but alive. She traced the rim of the empty stew bowl with her finger, then looked up at him, eyes wide with gratitude and a lingering shadow of fear. "They'll come back," she said softly, almost to herself. He nodded. He knew they would. Justice, vengeance, curiosity, or greed, the prairie never forgot, and the wronged never forgave. But for now, they had this moment. He handed her a cloth, showing her how to clean the grime from her face, and in the act, revealed more than care. It was a gesture of reassurance, an affirmation of trust. In the simplest actions, Thomas saw their bond strengthen, unspoken yet undeniable. When the sound of approaching hooves finally arrived, it was not the mob or lawmen he had feared. Instead, it was a solitary rider, face lined with age and wear, eyes cautious yet understanding. He slowed, dismounted, and nodded to Thomas, acknowledging the moral line that had been crossed. "I heard you took someone in," the man said, voice gravelly. "A girl, wasn't she?" Thomas nodded. There was no need for further explanation. Actions had already spoken. The rider left with a nod, leaving them in silence broken only by the wind through the grass. The prairie, harsh as ever, seemed almost to bow in respect for the choice made within the small cabin. The girl finally smiled, faint, tentative, but genuine, a fragile bloom in a landscape hardened by hardship. Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest, the kind of release that came only after moral courage had been tested and upheld. Weeks later, the prairie would remember this night differently. A girl who should have been forgotten survived. A man hardened by loss chose compassion over fear. Their lives intertwined not by chance, but by the deliberate choice to act rightly in a world that often demanded otherwise. And sometimes, that was the only justice worth having. Thomas watched her ride off, the wind tugging at her hair. As the dust settled, he whispered to himself, "We did what we had to do." And for the first time in years, he believed it. The prairie stretched endless, silent, but the echo of their courage lingered, a quiet testament that even in the harshest West, humanity could prevail.